Today, the government of Libya announced the death of Muammar Gaddafi.
In 2011, Libyan forces moved through their own cities as the country began to fracture. Armed rebels took control of neighborhoods. Government troops advanced to retake them. Tanks rolled through streets that had known peace for decades. Fighter jets filled the skies. Within days, Libya was no longer a state. It was a battlefield. The world watched as a rebellion against Muammar Gaddafi turned into a full-scale war. Western leaders called it a humanitarian crisis. Arab governments called for intervention. NATO prepared its aircraft. And inside Libya, the balance of power collapsed faster than anyone expected. For 42 years, Muammar Gaddafi stood defiant against kings, presidents, and empires, surviving coups, sanctions, bombings, and isolation. Muammar Gaddafi stood at the center of global power without ever calling himself a president. He challenged the West, humiliated Arab rulers, and dared to imagine a future Africa free from foreign control.
Of strength, of power, of dignity, of freedom for Africa!
But every war has a final battlefield. And when Libya burned in 2011, the enemies closing in were not only NATO jets in the sky, they were the Arab nations who voted in silence, the allies who turned away, and the brothers who chose survival over loyalty. This is the story of how a revolution hardened into rule, how power created enemies on every side, and how a leader who fought the world was finally surrounded by it. In the early hours of September 1st, 1969, while Libya's King Idris was out of the country receiving medical treatment, a small group of young military officers quietly took control of the state. There were no mass protests, no street battles, no dramatic gunfire echoing through the capital. By sunrise, Libya's monarchy, which had ruled since independence, was finished. At the center of this operation was a 27-year-old army captain named Muammar Gaddafi, a man almost no one outside military circles knew, and one few expected to change the course of Libyan history. Gaddafi did not come from wealth or royalty. He grew up in a modest Bedouin family, shaped by desert life, Islamic values, and stories of Arab resistance against colonial domination. As a young officer, he was deeply influenced by the rise of Arab nationalism sweeping the Middle East, especially the example of leaders who challenged Western control over their nations. To him, Libya's monarchy symbolized weakness, a government closely aligned with foreign interests, while much of the population remained disconnected from real power. What made this moment remarkable was not just how quickly power changed hands, but how easily it happened. The monarchy collapsed not because it was violently defeated, but because it had already lost its grip on the people and the military. Gaddafi and his fellow officers presented themselves not as conquerors, but as restorers, young men claiming they were returning Libya to its people, its dignity, and its future. At the time, many Libyans welcomed the change. The new leadership promised independence from foreign influence, an end to corruption, and a Libya that would no longer exist on the margins of global power. Few could have imagined that this quiet, almost invisible takeover would mark the beginning of a 42-year rule, one that would transform Libya into one of Africa's wealthiest nations. And with that single bloodless coup, Muammar Gaddafi stepped onto the world stage, not yet as a strongman, not yet as a symbol, but as a young revolutionary convinced that history had chosen him. When Muammar Gaddafi took power, Libya was already sitting on one of the largest oil reserves in Africa, but most Libyans barely felt its benefits. Foreign oil companies controlled production, pricing, and profits, while the state received only a fraction of the wealth flowing out of its own soil. To Gaddafi, this was not just economic injustice. It was modern colonialism wearing a legal suit, and he made it clear early on that this was not a system he intended to tolerate. Within months of consolidating power, Gaddafi moved decisively. He renegotiated oil contracts, increased state ownership, and eventually nationalized large portions of Libya's oil industry. For the first time, Libya controlled its most valuable resource, and the money that once flowed outward began flowing inward. Almost overnight, the balance of power between Libya and the West shifted. The impact was dramatic. Oil revenues exploded, and the Libyan state suddenly had the resources to fund massive social programs. Education became free, healthcare expanded nationwide, housing projects multiplied, and infrastructure reached regions long ignored. Libya's standard of living rose to one of the highest in Africa, and for many ordinary Libyans, life visibly improved. In the eyes of his supporters, Gaddafi had done what few African or Arab leaders dared. He took back control and made the nation wealthy on its own terms. But this transformation came with consequences. Western governments and corporations, once comfortable operating freely in Libya, now saw Gaddafi as unpredictable and dangerous. He had proven that a small country could defy powerful interests and succeed. For Gaddafi, oil was more than money. It was leverage. It gave him independence, confidence, and a sense of historical mission. It allowed him to speak boldly on the world stage, to fund ideological projects, and to challenge powers far larger than Libya itself. But it also placed a target on his back, because history has shown, again and again, that leaders who control their resources without permission rarely go unpunished. And with Libya's wealth secured, Gaddafi stepped into a new phase of his rule, one where the world could no longer ignore him, and where alliances would begin to shift in unpredictable ways. At first, the West didn't know what to make of Muammar Gaddafi, a young revolutionary who had seized power without bloodshed and reclaimed his country's resources was not immediately treated as an enemy. In fact, some Western leaders quietly admired his confidence. Libya was stable, oil continued to flow, and Gaddafi presented himself as a nationalist reformer rather than a communist radical. For a brief moment, he was tolerated, even respected. That relationship didn't last. As Gaddafi grew more outspoken, his tone hardened. He openly criticized Western military presence in the Middle East, accused global powers of exploiting Africa and the Arab world, and funded movements that directly challenged Western allies. By the 1980s, the relationship had collapsed entirely. Sanctions followed. Diplomatic ties were cut. Libya was portrayed as a global threat, and Gaddafi became a permanent fixture in Western media as a dangerous strongman. Airstrikes hit Libyan territory. His name was linked to terrorism, and Libya was isolated from much of the international system. For years, he ruled under pressure, convinced that the West was not just opposing him, but actively waiting for his downfall. Then something unexpected happened. In the early 2000s, Gaddafi changed course. He opened negotiations, accepted responsibility for past conflicts, paid compensation, and dismantled weapons programs that worried the West. Slowly, sanctions were lifted. Western diplomats returned. Oil companies re-entered Libya. The same leaders who once condemned him now shook his hand. Gaddafi was welcomed back into international meetings, not as a revolutionary, but as a partner. To outsiders, it looked like reconciliation. To Gaddafi, it was strategic survival. He believed he had finally secured Libya's place in the global system, that cooperation would protect him from the fate of leaders who resisted too hard for too long. And when usefulness ends, so does protection. Because while the West's attention came and went, Gaddafi was still searching for a political home, and he believed he could find it in the Arab world. Long before Muammar Gaddafi became a Pan-African figure, his political identity was firmly rooted in the Arab world. As a young officer, he was deeply influenced by Arab nationalism, the belief that Arab nations, divided by colonial borders, should unite as one people with one destiny. He saw himself as a spiritual and ideological successor to leaders who had challenged Western dominance in the Middle East, and he believed Libya's future was inseparable from that vision. To Gaddafi, Arab unity was not a dream, it was an obligation. With this conviction, he pursued one ambitious goal repeatedly: the creation of a single Arab nation. Over the years, he attempted political unions with Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, Algeria, Sudan, and others. Each attempt followed the same pattern: grand declarations, bold speeches, and sudden collapses. Arab leaders viewed Gaddafi as unpredictable, too radical, and unwilling to share real power. At the same time, Gaddafi distrusted them just as deeply, seeing many as compromised by Western alliances and more interested in preserving their thrones than transforming the Arab world. What began as ideological disagreement soon turned personal. Gaddafi openly criticized Arab rulers at summits, mocked monarchies, and accused leaders of betraying Palestine and serving foreign interests. These were not private diplomatic disputes. They were public humiliations. Over time, resentment hardened on all sides. Arab leaders did not forget his words, and Gaddafi did not soften his tone. The Arab world he wanted to lead increasingly treated him as an outsider. The final rupture came during the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Gaddafi strongly opposed the war, warning that foreign intervention would destabilize the entire region and expose Arab nations to long-term chaos. But his warnings were ignored. Arab governments distanced themselves, choosing silence, cooperation, or quiet approval instead. In that moment, Gaddafi realized something critical. Even when he was right, he no longer had influence in the Arab world. His voice carried no weight among leaders who had already decided he was expendable. By then, the rejection was complete. Gaddafi no longer saw a future for himself in Arab leadership circles, and Arab governments no longer saw him as one of their own. The dream of Arab unity, the foundation of his early political identity, had collapsed entirely, and that collapse pushed him toward a different path, one that would redefine his legacy. With the Arab world closed to him, Gaddafi turned fully toward Africa, a continent that welcomed him not as a problem, but as a patron, a partner, and a champion. But that shift would come with its own consequences, and it would further isolate him from the very region that would later play a decisive role in his downfall. As Muammar Gaddafi's ties with the Arab world collapsed, he redirected his vision toward Africa with full force. No modern African leader invested as deeply or as boldly in Pan-Africanism as he did. He funded African Union programs, pushed for a single African currency, advocated for African-controlled banks and satellites, and spoke relentlessly about freeing the continent from Western financial dependence. Across Africa, he was welcomed as a benefactor and a visionary, a leader willing to use Libya's wealth not just for his own country, but for an entire continent long denied power on the global stage. Yet while Gaddafi's image abroad was transforming into that of Africa's loudest defender, life inside Libya was becoming increasingly controlled. Political dissent was not tolerated. Opposition parties were banned, criticism of the state was treated as betrayal, and fear became a silent but constant presence in public life. Gaddafi argued that Western-style democracy was a lie and that Libya practiced a purer form of people's power, but in reality, authority flowed in only one direction, toward him. To enforce this system, Gaddafi relied on an internal mechanism known as the revolutionary committees. These groups operated outside normal legal boundaries, acting as ideological enforcers of the revolution. They monitored universities, workplaces, and media, ensuring loyalty to Gaddafi's vision and swiftly punishing deviation. Their presence blurred the line between government and surveillance, creating an environment where self-censorship became a survival skill. Even supporters understood that certain questions should never be asked. The most devastating expression of this repression came in 1996 at Abu Salim prison. After unrest among detainees, security forces reportedly killed more than 1,200 prisoners in a single day. Families were left without answers for years, denied information about their loved one's fate. The massacre became a quiet scar on Libya's national conscience, one that contradicted Gaddafi's image as a liberator and exposed the human cost of absolute control. For many Libyans, Abu Salim marked the moment when fear replaced hope entirely. This contradiction defined Gaddafi's rule in its later years. To millions across Africa, he was a champion of dignity and independence. To many within Libya, he was an untouchable authority whose power was enforced through silence and force. Both realities existed at the same time, and neither could erase the other. And it was this imbalance, a leader celebrated beyond his borders but increasingly resented within them, that left Gaddafi dangerously exposed when his final crisis arrived. By the time Muammar Gaddafi entered the final decade of his rule, his relationship with the outside world had grown dangerously thin. Accusations of terrorism, some proven, others deeply contested, had followed him for years, shaping how global powers viewed Libya. Gaddafi's name became permanently linked to instability in international discourse. Even when he attempted reconciliation, paid compensation, and re-entered diplomatic spaces, the stigma never fully disappeared. At the same time, Libya's role as a transit state for African migrants exposed another dark and deeply painful chapter. Under Gaddafi's government, sub-Saharan migrants faced abuse, arbitrary detention, and brutal conditions, the foundations of what later erupted into open slave markets after his fall. While the post-2011 chaos magnified the horror, the system itself did not appear overnight. It was rooted in years of neglect, racial tension, and policies that treated human movement as a security problem rather than a human one. When the Arab Spring erupted in 2011, Gaddafi stood isolated. His long history of clashing with Arab leaders, humiliating monarchs, and challenging regional power structures came back to haunt him. Arab governments did not rally to his defense. Instead, many quietly, and some openly, supported his removal. The Arab League's decision to back a no-fly zone gave NATO the political cover it needed to intervene. This moment was decisive. Gaddafi had always believed that, whatever happened, the Arab world would never fully turn against one of its own. But he was wrong. When Gaddafi fell, the state collapsed with him. Not because Libya lacked resources, but because power had been built around one man instead of lasting institutions. The country that once boasted the highest living standards in Africa became a battlefield for competing foreign and domestic interests. Muammar Gaddafi's story resists simplicity. He rose as a revolutionary who challenged kings and empires without firing a single shot. He transformed Libya's wealth into influence and dared to imagine a united Arab world, then a sovereign Africa. But he also ruled with fear, silenced dissent, tolerated brutality, and built a system that could not survive.